Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Reese Bradley, and I am the Elementary Social Studies Education Associate here in the Office of Assessment and Standards at the South Carolina Department of Education. I'm glad that you've joined me this afternoon. Today we'll be having a PD session on continuity and change in elementary social studies. So before we get into this, I just want to quickly go over a few things in Teams. We have the chat function, which we will be using today. You just click on that button and the chat menu will open on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll then type in at the bottom and hit enter in order to be able to enter things into the chat. Also, we have the raise hand function, so you click that button if you need my attention or the attention of my co-pilot for any reason. We have the reactions feature where you can select a different emoji or reaction, such as a heart. And then we also have here the camera and microphone. Of course, please feel free to mute and unmute yourself throughout the session as we have group discussion and things like that. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So here we have the profile of the South Carolina graduate. If you could, in the chat or come off mute, please share where you feel this fits into social studies, or where social studies fits into this profile. Seeing some things in the chat. Yeah, so social studies falls under the world-class skills, where we have things like critical thinking and problem solving, global perspectives under characteristics. We also have the social sciences under world-class knowledge. Also, depending on how we implement our instruction in the classroom, we have things such as communication, teamwork, collaboration that are also tools that we could see in social studies, or those world-class skills that we see coming out in our social studies instruction. So as we get started today, I want to do a quick waterfall activity. So we're going to take just a few minutes here, and I want everybody to type into that chat box what's one thing you already know about continuity and change. Do not hit enter yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to count to 3, and we're all going to hit enter together, and we'll have a waterfall in the chat of our responses. All right, 1, 2, 3, enter. Okay, I'm seeing several responses come in. We've got some good answers. Change over time, history, noticing patterns. Yes. So those are some great answers. So first, before we really get into this, I want to look at the definition of continuity and change. This is the definition of continuity and change in our current standards. I'm going to give you a moment to read that. And while you're reading it, I want you to think about which words or phrases stick out to you. So some of these terms and these words are very similar to things that y'all mentioned in our waterfall, such as the patterns. So really quickly, I just want to point out that continuity is large-scale historical processes that remain constant. So that's the parameters for continuity. It's something that happens large-scale over a long period of time. And then with change, we have things that remain limited in time and space. So it's things that sort of have an endpoint. And the scopes of those two things can be different. Change is often marked by turning points, which are necessary to identify when we're looking at change over time, though we don't really look at turning points until, I think, level 2. Also, want to specifically point out the identification of patterns, because this is really the heart of continuity and change, and also the heart of history in general. I want to note here that CC is in our indicator coding in the South Carolina standards is what represents continuity and change for anybody who may not be familiar with our coding system. In grades 4 and 5 in elementary, the last 2 letters in that indicator code indicate that skill that's tied to the indicator. So now we're going to go into breakout groups, and each group is going to have 2 small sets of cards to sort. I want you to sort those cards into 2 piles by dragging the text boxes into 2 different piles. Use them like you would cards in a physical space. One group is continuities and changes, and so you'll move those into continuities and changes, and the second is a bunch of vocabulary, and I want you to sort that vocabulary into continuities, changes, or both. So 3 piles on that one. Each group is going to have a different color set of cards, so there will be 2 slides of each color. Pick a different color for each group so that you can work within that space without interfering with each other. We're going to come back together in about 3 minutes. All right, so we just had some great discussion about what we noticed, about some of these things being a little bit harder to sort than maybe we thought. And we realized that with a lot of these, we were identifying things rather than justifying them. So this is that basic identification component, which is what we expect our fourth graders to be able to do. And this is the first step in really building that skill of continuity and change where we start looking at those bigger patterns, just that identification component of things are the same or things are different. So I'm going to give y'all the option whether you want to look at classrooms or phones. Y'all can send it in the chat really quickly. All right, we actually have time, so we'll go ahead and do both since I saw about an equal number of votes for each. So we're about to look at a series of photos. We're going to spend about 15 to 20 seconds on each photo. I want you to observe each photo and think about what is the same and what is different than the photo before or the photo after it. Look at what stands out to you. What do you notice? So this first set is classrooms over time. So we're going to look at classrooms across a variety of time periods. So with that, we're going to get started. Next one. All right. Next. All right, so here, these are going to be a little bit harder to see, but we have all of those photos here. So I want you to ask yourself, one, what stood out to you in those images? In the chat, I'd like you to send something you noticed that stayed the same across those images. Seeing some responses about desks and tables. And then also send in the chat what you noticed that changed across those images. Seeing some comments about clothes. The furniture looks different. Yeah, the surroundings in the classroom themselves appear a little bit different. Yeah, and then you also start to see people of both genders in classrooms, as well as people of varying races and ethnicities and backgrounds in different classrooms. So now we're going to look at the next set. We're going to repeat that process again. And the last one. All right, so here we have that timeline with all of our photos, again, really small. So again, I want you to take a moment and think to yourself about what stood out to you in those images. I'll give you just a minute to collect your thoughts, looking at all of them there. Now again, in the chat, what stayed the same? People holding things up to their ears. Yeah. Right, and then what changed? Yeah, they went from being hooked to a wall to being outside. So, and also the phones seemed to get smaller, right? They went from 2 pieces to 1 piece to hooked to a wall to free, and then from big and clunky to something that now fits in the palm of our hand. So this is the progression from Appendix A in the standards. And I want you to take a moment and look across what these continuity and change standards look like in kindergarten through second grade, and just think about how continuity and change starts and grows in primary grades. All right. So in kindergarten, we start with things that are direct to the student, right? So things that happen with individuals. We can give them examples within their own selves over the course of a school year, or even, over the course of their lifetime, right? Maybe they had a sibling that was born, maybe they got a pet. So that would be something that would maybe be a change. In first grade, we start looking at how communities change. So it gets a little bit bigger, but it's still something that we can tie to that student if they look at their community. And in second grade, we start looking at those bigger patterns of continuity and change within US history, and we start incorporating evidence. And so with that incorporation of evidence is the activity that we just did, right? We were looking at images from across time to identify that continuity and change over time with things that students are familiar with, like classrooms or cell phones and changes in technology. Another really great one that I like to use is transportation. So we go from horses to, we have bicycles, we have cars, we have trains, planes. We have all of these changes that are happening around us, but then the continuity is that people are still moving, right? I just want to note really quickly, for those of you who were here at last month's webinar, in a lot of ways, continuity and change is comparison plus time. And so sometimes continuity and change can be a little bit hard to wrap our heads around, despite the fact that it seems so simple. But really, when it comes down to it, it's comparison plus time. Is it something the same or different over time? And you just start stacking on comparisons over time to that, right? So, right, all right. So now, is anybody here a fan of Winnie the Pooh? I'm a really big fan of Winnie the Pooh. And so the author of those Winnie the Pooh books also wrote this poem. So we're going to read it together. When I was 1, I had just begun. When I was 2, I was nearly new. When I was 3, I was hardly me. When I was 4, I was not much more. When I was 5, I was just alive. But now I am 6. I am as clever as clever. So I think I'll be 6 now forever and ever. So when you read this poem, do you see continuity and change here? See, and some people say no, some people say yes. Could you add an extra line now about your age now? I'm not going to ask you to send it because I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable. Yeah, so here we see continuities in that we're growing, right? And when we get to be 6, we want to be clever forever. So that's something that'll be the same, clever from 6 onward. But every year we see a little bit of change. You'd begun and then you were new. You weren't quite you weren't much more, you're just a lot. So there's these small changes that occur over the course of the poem. So in what ways could you use something like this poem as a prompt for conversation in your class? It's a way to sort of incorporate some literary elements into this that we could use to start this discussion. Thank y'all for those responses. So here we have some photos from across my life. I've covered my friends and family with smiley faces to protect their privacy. In the chat, could somebody tell me what kind of source these photos are? Yes, they're primary sources. Primary sources don't always have to be ancient, right? So the things we carry around in our pockets, the images on the smartphones, those are primary sources from our life that are contained in that. So photos are primary sources, and they're a really great way to integrate primary sources into lower levels. It doesn't always have to be complicated to do. It doesn't have to be tied to the distant past. Personal connections and histories that are in the present day are great ways to make new concepts like continuity and change accessible for younger learners. So as I said, y'all can see various phases from across my life here, different scenes. Um, this is a much more complex continuity and change timeline than I would give to a primary grade band student. But I did this so that we can look at different types of continuity and change that happen, right? So I was an only child for many years, and then my sister was born. So that was a change. I've always loved school. So you see me going through high school and college, and that was great. I've always liked to travel. I've always liked history. So I'm there at various cultural and historic sites. I had a dog as a child, and I have a dog now, but they're different kinds of dogs. So that's a change. And, things that you can do with your students that would be more relatable are things like having a sibling. I still have brown hair like I always have. You can see that in all of my pictures. My favorite color now is dark blue, but when I was little, it was red. So that's something that's a change. So one way that you can easily pre-plan for continuity and change over the course of a school year would be to create like a favorites list for your students at the start of the school year or at the start of a quarter, and then do it again at the end. And then you can do a comparison of those things over the course of the school year at various times so they can see how they've stayed the same or changed over the course of the school year with things like favorite color, their hair length, did they lose a tooth, did they get a sibling or a pet? And even talking about the transition to the next school year toward the end of the school year. So you can also look at continuity and change over the course of a single day in your classroom, right? They're always learning, but they're going to go from learning ELA to learning math to having a social studies lesson. They might go to lunch. So there's transitions and things that naturally occur that you can use to sort of teach that to your students in a way that's accessible. So they start to begin understand that change over time as they begin to wrap their heads around this thing called time that exists. So now we're going to watch a video, and I want you to pay attention because we're actually going to do an activity with this momentarily. So I'm going to hit play. Here we go.
The Little House, written and illustrated by Virginia Lee Burton. Once upon a time, there was a little house way out in the country. She was a pretty little house, and she was strong and well built. The little house was very happy as she sat on the hill and watched the countryside around her. She watched the sun rise in the morning, and she watched the sun set in the evening. In the nights, she watched the moon grow from a thin new moon to a full moon, then back again to a thin old moon. And when there was no moon, she watched the stars. Way off in the distance, she could see the lights of the city. The little house watched the countryside slowly change with the seasons.
So now that we have watched that video, we're going to go into breakout groups. In the chat, you're going to click on the following links. You're going to be going into groups. I want you to go ahead and copy both links. There's going to be a copy of a chart that you're going to fill out with your group, and there's also going to be a link to a scanned PDF of the book that we just read in that video. One member of your group can share their screen with the little square up at the top with the arrow in order for everyone in that group to see their screen and work together on that document in the breakout groups. And then we're going to come back together and have a discussion afterward. All right, so we're back. So really quickly, I just want to ask how you would use an activity like this in your classroom. Did this book relate to anything happening in your community? I know in my hometown, there's been a lot of change with, infrastructure, more things being built. And so the last question I want to ask is, could stories like this be used to discuss current events in an approachable way? Using children's books, picture books, and literature is a really good way to start discussing things sometimes with your class. And I think a book like this that shows change over time, like over the life of that little house, is also a really great way to introduce students to concepts like continuity and change. And it's also in a format that's not necessarily content heavy for social studies, but it is still allowing them to practice that skill of continuity and change within the frame of using a story. So this is from our historical thinking skills progression document that's on the social studies instructional resources page. For primary teachers, do you think that your students can do parts of the level 1 column? Like which pieces do you see there that we just talked about in that appendix strip of our standards in K through 2? I'm seeing lots of people pointing out the identification component, which is accurate. So then what do you notice about how skill expectations change from elementary to high school? And here's your grade levels here at the top. Gets more complex. We see theme come in more, looking at sort of the scale of that impact. Yeah. So for those who were here in April and are familiar with the historical thinking skills, what language do you see here that sounds like other skills that we have looked at, specifically comparison? We're seeing that identification and description again, that same split between those two levels. We're seeing terminology like characteristics can explain the difference between continuity and change. So we're seeing that same and different come up. Yeah, so there's a lot of aspects of continuity and change that are like comparison. So again, I will just say that continuity and change, if it helps for you to think about it that way, at its most basic is comparison plus time. And then as you get into those upper levels, it gets more complex and you're looking at the patterns and scale of those change and processes that have occurred over time. So really quickly, what you need to keep in mind for planning and instruction with this skill is that it's largely conceptual. It's about connections between things in history. So those connections between things are patterns, and it's the identification of those things that stay the same, that become different, that make those changes occur, and why those changes occur, and why they matter, that really is the basis for continuity and change. When planning for CC indicators, look for a few key ideas of what changed or stayed the same over that time period. So looking at the period before that you're planning for or the period after the one you're planning for will help give you more context as an instructor when you're doing that planning to help pull those key ideas out. Key ideas would be things like slavery ending as a result of the Civil War, emancipation, and the ratification of the 13th Amendment. It existed from the founding of the colonies up until that point. And those things are where the change occurs and it is abolished within the United States. So after pulling out those key ideas, you can pull examples or evidence of how those things changed or stayed the same. And the evidence could be things like artifacts from the past, events and situations, people and perspectives within that time period that show those characteristics. And it's also where you can pull in that content for students to make those connections. So really quickly, we're just going to look at a content example of this, and I'm going to start by selecting a 5th grade indicator, which here is continuities and changes and relations as a result of Briggs v. Elliott and Brown versus Board. I'm going to give y'all just a minute to read that. Can I get a thumbs up when y'all are good? All right, I'm starting to see some thumbs up reactions, so we're going to go ahead and move on. So in order to find those key concepts, first we need to pull some background information and brush up on our own content knowledge before we start making those connections. So here's just a couple of places that you can look. If you have questions about specific content resources, please reach out to me, and I'm happy to give recommendations on where you can find further information. I always recommend checking our alignment guide, Expository Narratives. They're really good. They tell the story of history in a way that's really succinct and easy to understand. Your textbooks can be helpful as well as content area books, district resources, trusted websites, and other things like SC Discus. There's some good resources in there. So key ideas and continuities and changes within this time period that I've pulled out or within the standard are desegregation, the civil rights movement, and race relations. So from that content, you're going to find your central ideas or through lines of continuities, changes, and identify turning points. So in this time period, I chose these 3 buckets for today's example: desegregation, civil rights movement, and race relations. And all of these are obviously interrelated, but by breaking them out, it's going to allow us to have better discussion about what changes took place and also the changes that were still yet to occur, and then the circumstances that continued across those time periods. And those are going to allow us to point at pieces of the story to identify turning points and alignment with comparison of larger patterns throughout history. So for each of these through lines, you're going to then use content to show that over time. Here would be people's lived experiences and stories, prominent figures from movements, legislation, in an age-appropriate format. Of course, you're not going to drop a Supreme Court case on 5th graders, and more. So tying in content, the specific, so like the Friendship 9 from Rock Hill, Septum Points at Clark, Briggs v. Elliott, South Carolina, can show that push for progress and changes. And approaching these ideas through vetted primary sources is also a great way to show how the time period, to show that time period through the lenses of people who were living in it, and to demonstrate the impacts of continuities and changes in real time. Going back in time to discuss the birth of Jim Crow in cases like Plessy versus Ferguson can show a continuity of the struggle for equal rights and treatment, even after emancipation, to show that pattern of struggles that were faced over time. I selected this indicator specifically because of the interconnectedness and multifacetedness of this content and the ways that progress could be made through change, while there were still challenges for the African American community, such as segregation by tradition rather than law in many areas. Continuity and change can also coexist within the same time period, so understanding of both concepts and looking at the larger picture over time is still really important for this skill. And that's where things can get a little bit more complex. But this is a really good example of how you can have things change and stay the same at the same time, if that makes sense, or occur concurrently within that time period. Next, I want to look at a few different ways that we can allow students to explore continuity and change using various types of content and media. So the first is a graph, and this is actually a primary source graph that was produced by the US government. I would not recommend giving this to a student just because there's a lot going on. But I wanted to show this as a primary source and look at the variety of economic continuities and changes over time. And because this is such a complex chart, there's so many things going on, there's a lot of different things that we can point out here as continuities and changes over time. So looking at your screen, drop in the chat one continuity or change that you see on this chart. I see people saying that the presidents have changed, which is a good one. Lots of ups and downs. You see different events like the World War, both the World Wars. Yeah. So there's a lot of continuities and changes that we're seeing here. So now I want you to look at this green line and I want you to follow that. And that's showing the national income in the billions. And we see a really sharp drop after a boom in the 1920s. I'm going to go ahead and put a star here under this star so y'all can see that. This is a clear turning point in that data. So from your knowledge of history, what do you think this turning point is? Yeah, so we see the stock market crash having a huge impact on the economy there. The next 2 slides are going to show continuity and change in using line graphs. This one is a bit more student friendly. Here we have a chart showing the number of jobs at U.S. Steel from 1921 to 1933, pulled from annual U.S. Steel Company reports. What do you notice here? Yeah, we have a really sharp drop off there after 1929, 1930. And what is that? It's the Great Depression. So we do have that turning point there that we can see visually in data. So here we have census data for the percentage of African Americans of the total state populations of South Carolina and Illinois by census year. And I want to know here what you notice. This one's a little bit more subtle. Yeah, so we start to see Illinois' percentage go up, and we also see South Carolina's percentage go down. And this is reflective of, yep, somebody just dropped in the chat, Great Migration. So this is another way that you can use data to show that change that begins to occur over time. So now we're going to take a moment and listen to a couple of real sound clips from the Library of Congress. I want you to listen to each clip, and while doing so, I want you to think about what you hear, how it sounds, how it makes you feel, and what kinds of instruments you can pick out if you're somebody that's musically inclined. So I'm going to start clip 1.
The Gambling Man, sung by Bob Roberts, Columbia Records. Bill Williams was a gambling man, one of the reckless kind. A game of sports in all the world, I'm sure you couldn't find. He bet on anything at all, he bet the day was night. And just to satisfy himself, he bet that black was white. When he was broke, he seldom spoke to anyone at all.
All right, so now we're going to go to number 2.
Today to the hill, Maggie, to watch the scene below. The creek and the creaking old mill, Maggie, as we used to long, long ago. The green grove is gone from the hill, Maggie, where first the daisy sprung. The green.
Right. And now we're going to go to recording number 3. All right, so in the chat, drop kind of what you heard, how it sounded, how you felt. Seeing some people say the first 2 almost put them to sleep. The middle one was kind of sad. The middle one was kind of sad. Yeah, and so we see, the last one made you want to dance. Yeah. So this is a good way to show kind of how music changed over time. We start getting into the Roaring 20s. We've got different instruments being played. We hear a lot more brassy type instruments being played in that 1920s recording versus just a piano in 1906. So this is another way to sort of show continuity and change over time and using different media types. So here we have another video that we're going to watch, and this is an animated video of population density in the US from 1790 to 2010. It's about 3 or 4 minutes long. We are going to watch the whole thing, and I want you to think about what changes, what stays the same, and maybe what some of the causes for those things are. And you can see this is kind of where we end up here in the 90s. So what did you notice over time? Were there any times where all of a sudden there was a lot of change, a lot of movement? Yeah, so it seemed like people were primarily moving westward. That is a continuity. People leaving the 13 colonies, yeah, so that was a change. Did anyone notice the period where some of those places in the middle of the country started to empty out in the 30s and 40s? Yeah, with the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and all those things that happened. I don't know if you noticed at the same time that emptied out, there were areas in California, specifically the regions where they did a lot more farming and some of the valleys, that the population exploded. Yeah, so you can use maps or images like those that we practiced with earlier to make continuity and change and visible just in a different way. Okay, that was an excellent discussion we just had about the different types of stimuli that we used over the course of the day. We saw charts, graphs, maps, audio, photos, paintings, all kinds of things in order to show continuity and change. We also looked at some content examples. We showed how we can pull in non-content tools to help make those basic concepts make sense for our youngest students as well. And we had several different strategies that we used today. So as always, I appreciate y'all coming and being here. Here is our contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm up there at the top, Reese Bradley, if you ever have any questions or if you'd like resources from this webinar. And thank you for your time today.